When you think of World War II, what's the first image that comes to mind? Is it D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, maybe the Soviet flag over the Reichstag? Now try to picture the Battle of Tarawa, the horrors of Peleliu, the desperate fight for Okinawa. While the European War is often seen as the great ideological struggle against fascism, the Pacific War was a conflict of unique, profound brutality. It wasn't defined by sweeping tank battles, but by suffocating humidity, treacherous coral reefs, and an enemy sworn to fight to the very last man. So why does this brutal essential chapter of the war, particularly the island-hopping campaign, feel so marginalized in our collective memory? Why does the image of the German surrender dominate our minds, while the fight to the death at Iwo Jima remains almost a historical footnote? The Pacific War began with the devastating shock of Pearl Harbor in December 1941. This attack instantly mobilized the United States, but it also forced military planners into a strategic corner. Japan now controlled vast stretches of the Pacific Ocean. To defeat them, the Allies faced an immense logistical challenge, conquering thousands of miles of ocean, island by island. This is where Generals Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz devised the core strategy known as island hopping, or leapfrogging. The goal wasn't to capture every single Japanese-held island. Instead, they would bypass heavily fortified areas, like the fortress of Rabaul, and secure only those islands essential for building airbases, refueling stations, and naval support. This focused the fighting on strategic choke points, allowing the Allied forces to advance rapidly while strangling the Japanese outposts left behind. Given the overwhelming size of the Pacific, was this island-hopping strategy a stroke of genius, or was it the only viable option available to the Allies? What made the Pacific War so uniquely brutal was the nature of the Japanese defense, which was deeply rooted in cultural doctrine. The Japanese military followed a strict interpretation of the Bushido Code, which emphasized loyalty and honor above all else. Surrender was considered the ultimate shame. This led to a military doctrine you almost never see: fight to the death. On islands like Peleliu and Iwo Jima, the Japanese didn't just fight on the beaches. They established deep, interlocking defensive systems of concrete bunkers and miles of tunnels and caves. Their goal wasn't to win the battle, but to inflict the maximum number of casualties possible, hoping to demoralize the Americans into negotiating peace. In fact, the Japanese general commanding the defense of Iwo Jima, Tadamichi Kuribayashi, instructed his men to kill 10 Americans before they themselves were killed. Allied forces quickly learned that surrender was almost never an option for the enemy. How does fighting an opponent who refuses to surrender fundamentally alter the ethical and psychological demands placed on an attacking soldier? The decisive battles in the Pacific were marked by a specific suffocating kind of horror: amphibious landings against heavily entrenched positions. Battles like Tarawa, Peleliu, and Okinawa were nothing like the wide-open tank battles of the Eastern Front. These involved U.S. Marines wading through sharp coral reefs or suffocating mud, often under direct point-blank machine gun fire from hidden pillboxes. The casualty rates were astronomical for the tiny pieces of territory involved. At Iwo Jima, the American casualty count, both killed and wounded, actually exceeded the number of Japanese defenders. This was the only time this happened in the entire Pacific War, and it shows that the entire point of the Japanese defense was pure attrition. Official histories emphasize that the sheer physical hardship of fighting in jungle and coral environments, combined with the extreme heat and constant threat of unseen enemy fire, created a psychological burden unlike anything seen in Europe. Could you imagine having the courage to rush a beach, knowing that every single defending soldier has been ordered to die on his feet rather than surrender? One of the key reasons the Pacific War is often forgotten is that its true opponent was the sheer vastness of the ocean. This made consistent media coverage and, more importantly, supply incredibly difficult. Supplying the Pacific campaign required a logistical feat that dwarfed the effort in the Atlantic. Fuel, food, ammunition, and troops had to be shipped across thousands of miles of open water to remote islands that had zero infrastructure. This is where we see the immense heroic role of the Seabees, the naval construction battalions. They were the logistical engine of the war. They would land immediately after the Marines to bulldoze airfields and build docks, turning remote volcanic rock into fully operational U.S. military bases in a matter of weeks. By 1944, the logistics in the Pacific were stretched so thin that the U.S. Navy often had to prioritize shipping fuel and repair parts over many other essential supplies, simply because the distances made the task so precarious. So, was the Pacific War won by the courage of the Marines on the beach, or by the engineering and supply capability of the Seabees working behind them? The final turning point of the Pacific War remains the most controversial decision in history. As the Allied forces advanced toward Japan's home islands, the brutal defense at Okinawa offered a horrifying glimpse into what a full-scale invasion of Japan would look like. At Okinawa, desperate military resistance combined with mass civilian casualties, many self-inflicted, led to over 150,000 Japanese deaths. The projected invasion of Japan, codenamed Operation Downfall, was predicted to cost up to 1 million Allied casualties. That staggering number, which would have dwarfed all American casualties in the European theater combined, was the final strategic calculation that led President Harry S. Truman to approve the use of the atomic bomb. Most historians conclude that the decision to use the bomb was a direct consequence of the unique, non-negotiable brutality of the island-hopping campaign. It wasn't a decision taken lightly. It was a military calculation designed to save lives, both Allied and Japanese, from a final apocalyptic invasion. If you had the power to end the war instantly, but knew the cost would be the destruction of a city, would you authorize it? Perhaps the most difficult reason the Pacific War remains in the shadows is the deeply racialized nature of the conflict, which blurred the moral lines for both sides. Propaganda on both sides often portrayed the war not as a fight against a political ideology, but as a fight against an enemy race. Americans viewed the Japanese as subhuman vermin, and the Japanese viewed the Americans as demons. This dehumanization led to unique atrocities and a near-total collapse of the willingness to take prisoners. Soldiers on both sides engaged in forms of brutality rarely seen in Europe. The psychological stories from this conflict are much harder to integrate into a post-war narrative that celebrates a clear victory of good versus evil. Historian John Dower has documented how the psychological need to demonize the enemy fueled this brutality, making the peace that followed that much harder to achieve. Does the dehumanization of an enemy, for propaganda purposes, ever become a necessary psychological tool for victory? Or is it always, without exception, a moral failure? But what if the U.S. had pursued a completely different strategy? What if they had avoided the direct invasion of the islands altogether? Some military thinkers have argued that the U.S. should have focused solely on an overwhelming naval and air blockade of Japan, slowly starving the islands into surrender without the high cost of amphibious invasions. While a blockade might have saved Allied lives, historians argue it would have taken much longer, potentially killing millions of Japanese civilians through famine and disease. Crucially, the captured islands provided the necessary launch points for the final air campaign against Japan. Without those islands, the U.S. Air Force couldn't have effectively reached the Japanese home islands. The consensus remains that without the land bases secured by the island-hopping campaign, the final phase of the war would have stalled, giving Japan more time to fortify its defenses. This leaves us with a difficult question. Which method of warfare, the slow, agonizing blockade, or the rapid, bloody invasion, carries the greater moral weight? The Pacific War is often marginalized because it was too geographically distant, too logistically complex, and too psychologically difficult to fit into the clean moral narrative of the post-war world. It was a war of grinding attrition, where bravery was measured not in dramatic charges but in sheer endurance against an enemy who refused to break. The island-hopping campaign, though less glamorous than the liberation of Europe, was the vital, grueling process that ground down the Imperial Japanese Army and set the stage for the final devastating act of the war. What is the single most overlooked battle or story from the Pacific Theater that you think deserves more attention? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into military history. Thanks for watching.